Hey everybody, it's so nice to talk to you today. So my presentation is going to be a little bit different. Over the past week, I've been walking around the landscape looking for plant diseases and talking about them. So there are going to be a lot of videos in my talk. Hopefully they work pretty well over Zoom. We'll see how it goes. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to myself and background. I am the new plant disease diagnostician. I started here mid-April, so I've been living in Virginia for the past 7 or 8 years, and I moved here to Delaware in the middle of the pandemic. I started this new job. I'm here in Townsend Hall. Campus is mostly closed except for some labs, like the plant disease clinic is open, the soils lab is open. It's been very weird. I still have yet to meet most of my colleagues in person, but everybody's been so gracious and helpful. All of the extension agents on this call, everyone has been so nice and welcoming. So I'm really happy to be here. A little bit of background about myself. So I grew up in central Pennsylvania. So of course I ended up going to Penn State University. I got my bachelor's degrees in biology and agroecology, which is like sustainable agriculture. After I graduated with my bachelor's degrees, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, so I took a year and I worked at Penn State's plant disease clinic, and that's when I just completely fell in love with plant diagnostics and knew that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up going to Virginia Tech for my master's degree, and I worked in root knot nematodes in tobacco, and that's a picture of me with a tobacco plant. And I had never seen tobacco until I moved to Virginia. It's a really neat plant. So for the past 4 years, I've been working at, or I had worked at a Virginia Tech research station on the eastern shore of Virginia. I was a research technician working with mostly vegetable crops, but also field crops, running fungicide, bactericide, nematicide trials. So this has definitely been a big learning experience for me to work with ornamental crops. I've already learned, ornamental plants. I've already learned a lot in the past 2 months, and I still have a lot to learn, but I'm excited about it. Oh, and also when I was at Virginia Tech, I headed our little plant disease clinic, which we got about 150 to 200 plant samples per year, mostly vegetable samples, a lot of tomato. So I'm gonna give a very, very brief introduction into plant pathology. So there are 4 organisms that can cause disease on plants: fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. Fungi comprise about 80% of plant pathogenic agents. So if you have a plant disease, odds are it's caused by a fungus. However, that doesn't mean the rest of these aren't significant. There are a lot of bacterial diseases, virus diseases, and nematode diseases. Most of what I'm going to talk about today are fungal. So you can't talk about plant pathology without talking about the disease triangle. In order to have a plant disease, you need 3 things. You need a pathogen to be present, you need a susceptible host, and you need a favorable environment. Without all 3 of these things together, you will not get a plant disease. So for instance, say you're growing a boxwood in a low area, and one year you have a ton of rainfall and you get a root rot disease. The rainfall is that perfect environment that root rot disease needs to thrive. Say the next year it's a drought, extremely dry, you may not get that same disease because the environment wasn't right. One of the best ways to break this disease triangle is to use a host that's resistant to his disease. And if you have all of these for a long period of time, that's how you get plant disease epidemics. I have a bunch of videos about leaf spots, and I'm going to start playing them now, and hopefully they work okay. This is a cherry leaf spot video. Flowering cherries are susceptible to a leaf spot disease called shot hole disease, kind of a catch-all name for 2 different diseases that cause these symptoms on cherry. So it could be caused by a bacterium, Xanthomonas, or a fungus, Blumeriella. So the lesions start off as these little reddish-brown circles on the leaves, and as they progress, the lesion actually falls out and causes these holes which looks like a BB holes or a shot hole appearance. It can be mistaken for insect feeding, but this is actually a disease, and sometimes it's quite severe. You can see all of the defoliation that has happened. Here, crunching all over the ground. And the tree does look pretty sparse. Whether you have the fungal or bacterial pathogen, both of these diseases are favored by wet weather. So with the wet spring we had, that's why there's such a severe infestation here. And as long as the wet weather persists, the diseases will persist. And they overwinter not only in debris that's fallen to the ground, but also in buds and on the stems. Fungicides can be applied for if you have the fungal disease, but it's a good idea to know which you have, if you have the fungus or the bacterial disease. But generally, as long as the weather dries out, the disease will not be an issue, and as long as you practice good sanitation. Now I have a couple videos about hydrangea leaf spots. So here we have an oak leaf hydrangea with leaf spots. Oh look, it's our old friend, poison ivy, growing right in there with it. So leaf spots on oak leaf hydrangea are really hard to know just from the naked eye what's causing them. There are 3 different leaf spots that are caused by fungi and 1 that's caused by bacteria. I think what we have going on here is bacterial leaf spot. You can see, let me find a good example. You can see that the leaf spots are kind of delineated by the veins. The bacteria can't travel through that hard tissue. So bacterial leaf spots often appear angular in that way. And fungal leaf spots on oak leaf hydrangea, one of the most common ones is Cercospora leaf spot, and the lesions will actually have a tan center. They will be purple like this, but they'll have a tan center. But it's really hard to know what you have just by looking at it, so that's why labs like ours are in existence, so people can send them in and figure out what they have. So if you have leaf spots like this, it's generally not a big deal. It's usually cosmetic. However, in severe cases, when the environment is right, with a lot of wet weather, it could become kind of bad. The best control options are sanitation, raking up leaves at the end of the year. If it's really bad, you can prune out shoots with it. However, if you have bacterial leaf spot, it's advised not to prune in wet weather. Otherwise, you can get that bacteria on your pruners and spread it. Another important control option for leaf spots is not to overhead water, because especially if you have a fungal leaf spot, the spores are going to be there right on top of the leaf spot, and if you overhead water, it'll splash and spread them around. So it's a good idea to only water at the base of the plant. So I've been walking around and I just found another hydrangea plant which has fungal leaf spots. So you can see the difference here. You see the tan spots there in the center of these leaf spots and how that's different from the other leaf spot. It does kind of look like these spots are delineated by the leaf veins. However, you can see that they are crossing the leaf veins like this, and they're more round in shape. This is a fungal leaf spot. You just want to rake up your leaves as they fall off throughout the season and make sure not to overwater, because that will spread all the little spores that are hanging out in here to other areas of the plant. So looking right up from the hydrangeas, this is a birch tree species. It's in the birch family. This is a great example of the difference between a bacterial leaf spot and a fungal leaf spot. So I believe this is a Cylindrosporium fungus causing these leaf spot diseases. You can see, you can even see signs of the fungus sporulating within these, right in the middle of the leaf spots. And here's an example of it not being delineated by the veins. Oftentimes with fungal leaf spots, you'll see signs, if you look closely enough, you'll see signs of the fungus sporulating, whether it's tiny little black dots, which are the fruiting bodies, or in this case, it looks like these, these are actually spore masses coming out of the middle of the leaf spot. Here's a maple tree with what looks like Philosticta leaf spots. It's caused by a fungus. I'm trying to get a good view. So maple trees get all sorts of different leaf spots. They get maple anthracnose, tar spot, all caused by fungi. Generally, they're not a big deal. They're just cosmetic. And the best control option is just to rake up the leaves at the end of the season so they're not an inoculum source for the next year. So this is a beautiful example of a fungal leaf spot. I just pulled this off a box elder tree. So if you're wondering if you have a fungal or bacterial leaf spot, like I said earlier, bacterial leaf spots will be more angular in appearance, but this is absolutely diagnostic for a fungal disease. If you look closely in the leaf spots, you'll see little tiny black dots, and those are the fungal fruiting bodies which house the spores. So I didn't get a video of this disease, but I wanted to talk about it. I'm going to speak louder. Nancy, actually, she's still been in contact with me, thankfully. She's been a huge help. She saw oak leaf blister when she was visiting her daughter. It's caused by the fungus Tephrina cerulescens. This disease is favored by cool, wet springs, and it's hard to see in this photo, but it has very distinct symptoms. The lesions there, the yellow lesions, are actually popped or blistered out. They protrude from the leaf surface, and then on the underside of the surface, they're actually concave up. So it's just like a blister on the surface of this oak leaf. All oak species are susceptible, but oaks in the red oak family are more susceptible. And the lesions start out yellow like this, but by the end of the season, they could turn a darker brown. And they're favored by a cool, wet spring, and if it stays cool and wet into the summer, it could cause some defoliation, but generally with the warmer weather, this disease just kind of tapers off. And there's also insect damage in this image. Those are not, those holes in the leaves are not caused by the disease. And Brian told me it's either caterpillars or beetles that cause those holes. Another disease we saw, this was from, someone brought this to the Sussex research station. It's an azalea gall. It's caused by the fungus Exobasidium vaccinii. So it's really distinct and easy to see once it sporulates like this. So the fungus gets into the leaf and it actually makes the leaf swell into a gall, and it'll start out like normal green leaf color, and then once it sporulates, it'll turn very white like that. It's really important to catch this disease, scout your azaleas, catch it before it turns white like that, because that's just millions of spores just waiting for a good rainfall to spread to other plants. This disease is also favored by cool, wet weather. So a good control option is to make sure your plants are well pruned, spaced apart, and it's also favored by shade. So if you move your plants or have plants in a sunnier area, you probably won't see this disease. Although Brian told me that if you move your plants into a sunny area, you'll get more lace bugs. Is that correct, Brian?
Yeah, so the azaleas.
Jill, we have a question. Oak leaf blister, is the current heat we are having now enough to stop the fungus?
I would say so, yes. Let me check on that during the break and give a definitive answer. But this is very hot weather for that fungus.
Yeah, and with putting azaleas out in sunlight, you get better flowering, but since azaleas are generally an understory plant, you tend to stress them a little bit, which makes them a little more susceptible to having high populations of azalea lace bugs.
Right, so it's a give and take.
Yeah.
Choose which pest you want. So, but this disease is easy to control. As long as you see these, just pick them off. Another thing that we've been noticing with azaleas and rhododendrons is dieback on shoots, likely caused by Botrosphaeria canker, which is a fungus. So if you're seeing dieback, the best thing to do is just prune off those shoots, those dead branches. So I have a couple videos here about dogwood, powdery mildew, and anthracnose. Spot anthracnose. So this is flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. A disease you might be seeing this spring is powdery mildew on dogwoods. So powdery mildew on dogwood doesn't always show the classic powdery mildew symptoms of the white powder, but we do have it here. Lighting isn't perfect. It grows on the top and the bottom of the leaves. And newer leaves with powdery mildew often will come out distorted, and that's from the powdery mildew. Older leaves don't always show the distinctive white powder. Sometimes they have more purple lesions here. It's hard to see. So this disease usually doesn't warrant a fungicide application, but to control it, you can prune out the dogwood to aid in air circulation, and there are also resistant varieties, which I had written on my hand here. So there's Jean's Appalachian Snow, Karen's Appalachian Blush, and Kay's Appalachian Mist. Those are all flowering dogwoods that are resistant to this disease. Cowsa dogwood is also resistant. Please ignore my mispronunciation. It's Coosa dogwood. Karen's Appalachian Blush and Kay's Appalachian Mist. Those are all flowering dogwoods that are resistant to this disease. Cowsa dogwood is also resistant to this, so if you grow flowering dogwood, Cowsa dogwood hybrids, you'll get that resistance as well. So this tree also has another disease on it, spot anthracnose here, which are these tiny little leaf spots. So spot anthracnose is not a very big deal. It's not a very damaging fungal disease. It shouldn't be confused with dogwood anthracnose, which is a very serious fungal disease on dogwoods. This one usually doesn't warrant any kind of fungicide application, but you should rake up the leaves in the fall and dispose of them, because otherwise that serves as an inoculum source. Dogwood spot anthracnose is caused by the fungus Elsinocornii, and dogwood anthracnose, which I'm not showing right now, is caused by Discula destructiva, another fungus. So these, for dogwood spot anthracnose, the spots never really get much bigger than this. They're tiny, and they can also actually infect the flowers and the flower bracts. You can see that here. And they can overwinter on the stems and in debris, so that's why it's suggested to rake them up at the end of the season. Dogwood anthracnose, which is more serious than this disease, will cause brown or purple spots on the leaves, and the lesions are going to be a lot larger than this, and they'll enlarge, and they can eventually cover the whole leaf, and that disease can actually kill a tree. So this is one of the most striking examples I've seen of a powdery mildew infestation. So all of these white spots are the mycelium and spores of the fungus. And if it rains, all of that gets splashed and spread. The great thing about powdery mildew is it's very species specific. So if you have it on one species, it's very unlikely that it's going to spread to your other plants. Sorry about the construction noises in that video. So similar to powdery mildew in that they're quite species specific and easy to spot are rust diseases. This was a rust that we saw on ash trees at the Carville Research Station. So rusts are a really interesting fungus in that they often, not always, but they often have two hosts. In order to complete their life cycle, they need both hosts. So you may have heard of cedar apple rust or wheat barberry rust, which was a very historic rust. This was the first time I'd seen this rust on ash trees. It's ash and its other host are marsh grasses. So this one is caused by Puccinia sparganioides. It's generally not going to be a big deal. It may defoliate a couple leaves, but it produces these amazing symptoms with these bright red pustules full of spores on the undersides of the leaves. So I wanted to take this time to mention that every time I see a leaf spot, the first thing I do is turn it over to see if there's any sporulation on the underside. You can oftentimes see signs of the fungus on the underside. So for this disease, just as in a lot of the other leaf spot diseases, sanitation, reducing plant stress are pretty much going to work out for control measures. So this was a rose plant. I took a little video of some leaf spots. This rose has what looks like Cercospora leaf spot here. In severe cases, Cercospora leaf spot can defoliate a plant, but it's not as bad as the other fungal disease, black spot. And you can differentiate these leaf spots. They often look similar with purple spots. However, you can differentiate them. Cercospora leaf spot usually has a tan center, while black spot doesn't. Black spot also has what I describe as fuzzy edges to its leaf spots. It looks like they're almost bleeding into the healthy part of the leaf. So this rose also has something else going on here. It has these stem cankers. Get this in focus. I don't think these are caused by the Cercospora leaf spot. There's a disease on rose called stem canker, but I also don't think that's what's going on here, because stem canker will actually girdle the stems and kill the shoots, and these shoots look okay. I was talking about black spot. I wanted to show the difference. So in the video, I was showing Cercospora leaf spot, which has that distinct tan center in the middle of the leaf spot. But this is black spot, which also has very distinct symptoms of almost the edges of the leaf spots are fuzzy or kind of bleeding out. So this leaf spot.
Jill?
Yes.
We have another question. Can you compost the leaves after you remove them from the tree, or is this a way to spread the fungus if the compost doesn't get hot enough? Referring to the dogwood.
It's a good idea to dispose of the leaves. That's what I would say. You can't be sure that composting them will get rid of the fungus, and better safe than sorry, I would dispose of them. But I also will check on that during the break to make sure. Okay, so this rose black spot can be a really severe disease on rose. It's also quite common. So it can defoliate a plant and it overwinters on the shoots. And if you have a couple years of defoliation, it's just going to cause so much stress to your plant that it will get secondary insect infestations, secondary diseases, and it can end up killing a plant.
Jill, we have another question about burning the leaves. So the question is, will burning the leaves kill the disease?
Yeah, burning the leaves is a perfectly fine disposal method. I usually say either throw them away in the garbage or burn them.
Okay, so with that being said, I'm only going to state that you cannot have fires when there's an edict by the fire marshal with a no burn in place. I've had people call me up saying I was fined by destroying bagworms by burning them because you said you could burn it and kill them. and I got a fine. And I'm like, but we're under a no burn order. And he's like, well, I didn't know that applied. And I'm like, well, yeah, when they say don't burn, don't start a fire.
Okay, that's a great point. Don't bring my name into this. You get in trouble.
Carol Kinsley also said it's illegal to burn leaves in Delaware.
Oh, okay, that's great to know. So then stick with throwing them away in the garbage. Okay, so moving on. This is the only viral disease that I'm going to talk about today, at least. So rose rosette virus has very distinct symptoms. You have, in the spring, you'll have shoot proliferation, persistent leaf or shoot reddening. So persistent means it stays red. A lot of times when your rose leaves out, it'll come out a red color and you might be nervous that you have rose rosette disease, but as the leaf matures, it will turn its regular green. But if you have rose rosette disease, it will not turn green. It'll persist as in that bright red color. It can also cause distortion and small leaves and an abundance of thorns. So unfortunately, there's not much you can do. Well, there's nothing you can do once you have this disease. If you notice one shoot showing symptoms, you might be able to catch it quick enough if you prune it off and just see if it grows back out healthy. If it doesn't, it's probably a good idea to remove the plant so the virus doesn't spread to other plants. It's spread by mites or by grafting. And wild multiflora rose are susceptible. So if you're near woods or something with wild multiflora rose, the disease can spread to your landscape roses through mites. One thing I did want to mention are canker diseases. So cankers are a symptom of infection by a fungi or bacteria. So both fungi and bacteria can cause different diseases that cause cankers. Symptoms can vary. You can have cracked, swollen, protruding, or sunken and dead areas on your branches or your trunks of trees. Usually canker diseases happen after there's been a wound in a trunk or a branch, or if the tree is already stressed for other reasons. The best thing to do if you have a canker disease on a branch is to prune it out well past the canker. Make sure you cut out all the infected area and sterilize your tools between cuts, especially if you know you have a bacterial canker, because then you can spread that disease on your pruners to another branch that you're cutting. If you have a canker on your trunk, unfortunately, there is not much you can do. Sometimes the tree walls off the infection and you're okay. Sometimes it doesn't, and you're just going to have to end up replacing that tree. Canker disease often occurs on a tree where there was a wound previously, which gave either a bacteria or a fungal pathogen the opening they needed to infect the tissue. Sometimes it could be from lawnmower injury, animal feeding. In this case, it looks like there was a branch here that broke off, and right in the crease there, it gave the opening to the pathogen. Canker diseases often take years to kill a plant, or yes, they can take years to kill a plant, or they may not kill it at all if it walls off the infection. This is a video about galls on forsythia. We have a forsythia here with a really interesting mystery. So forsythia often get these galls on their branches, and they cut off flow to the vascular system and can eventually kill shoots. This plant is covered. And so interestingly, we're not exactly sure what causes these. It's been linked to the fungus Phomopsis, to agrobacterium, or to genetic abnormalities. But regardless, it causes damage on plants. And the best thing to do if you have this is to prune it out. Since we're unsure exactly of what causes it, but if it is a bacteria, your pruning clippers could spread it. So it's a good idea to sterilize your pruners between cuts. here are some videos about root rot. I didn't see any trees or shrubs that looked like they were declining from a root rot, so I'm going to talk about it in front of this babbling brook. So there are a number of pathogens that can cause root rots, but one of the largest ones, and with a large host range, is Phytophthora root rot. Phytophthora is a fungal-like organism called an oomycete, and it lives in the soil and it likes wet conditions. So if you have poorly drained soils or soils in a low area, plants in those areas are often stressed and more predisposed to getting root rot from Phytophthora. Azalea, rhododendron, holly, and juniper are all susceptible. It's hard to know what's going on above ground when you have a root rot. Sometimes you'll have only one half of the plant that starts declining and dying. Sometimes the whole thing starts declining. I have one more video. So if you think your plant has a root rot, dig up some sections of the roots and check them out. If they're healthy, they should be nice white, tan, or cream color. If they have a root rot, they'll be dark. The cortex will break off easily, and they won't have a lot of little tiny feeder roots. However, if it's a really wet spot, the roots might look like that anyway from a lack of oxygen. If it's been diagnosed that you have Phytophthora root rot, unfortunately, there's not much you can do, and the pathogen can live in the soil for many years. So if you're trying to replant in that spot, you want to replant resistant plants. So then I found some other things in the landscape that weren't diseases, but I thought they were interesting anyway, and I wanted to share. So lichen, I've gotten a number of samples with lichen on them, and people think that they cause plant diseases, which is understandable because they often grow on dead tissues, but they're actually harmless. So a lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and either a cyanobacteria or an algae. They're harmless on plants, they're just using it as a substrate. There are three growth forms of lichen. This one is crustose or crustose, which is growing flat on the branch, but sometimes they'll protrude or even look almost like coral. If you see lichen on your plant, oftentimes it is an indication that something else is going on. You'll see here, these branches are pretty much dead, and that's only because the canopy is opened up with the dead tissue to allow more sunlight in, and that's the environment that lichen grow in. This plant is a wild grape species. It's not an invasive plant, meaning it's native to the United States. However, it can be a huge problem in landscape areas. It's growing on every tree and shrub right here. It's even up, probably growing on this tree, probably 30 feet up. So you might think of kudzu and other invasive species have the same growth. So this wouldn't be a problem if it was in the woods. It's a native species. It provides some habitat and food for animals. But in an urban area, it can be a huge problem. It's really hard to get rid of. Pretty much the only thing you can do is mechanically cut it down and treat this base of the stem with an herbicide. This is a pest walk, so I guess it's appropriate to talk about my least favorite pest in the whole world, poison ivy. Leaves of 3, let them be. Poison ivy is such a sneaky plant because, oh, there's my dog getting into it. Poison ivy is such a sneaky plant because the leaves can vary from light green to dark green to even purplish reddish. Sometimes they're shiny, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're large, very large, and sometimes they're tiny. And you can see the vine here growing up this tree. This isn't the best example of poison ivy. Okay, here we go. See, these are tiny and small and shiny, but the ones up here are a lot larger. Poison ivy usually grows in disturbed areas, like on the side of fields or on the side of a trail right here. You usually won't see it out in the open or deep in the understory. And dogs cannot get poison ivy, but if they get the oils on their fur, they can transfer it to humans, which I know from experience. Here's another good example of poison ivy. So you can see the differences in colors here and how shiny they are. This right here is a perfect example of shiny leaves on poison ivy, but then right over here, you have completely matte looking leaves. You can see the differences in shapes too. So this shiny one doesn't really have any serration on the leaf edge, but sometimes they look more like this.
This is a blooper video, but I wanted to include it.
Here's another good example of poison ivy. So you can see, I don't want to get my fingers too close to it. You can see, oh my God, Greg. Ah!
Okay, so I talked a lot about plant diseases, but one of the most important factors in any plant disease and even insect infestation are abiotic factors. You can't ignore the environment and other factors that will put stress on a plant, and I wanted to go over some of them. So any of these things can cause stress to a plant and kill a plant alone or make it more susceptible to a disease. So drought, excess water, 2018 was a washout of a year followed by extreme drought in 2019. And a lot of tree species are actually showing repercussions of that now. They were so stressed out for 2 years, you might see a tree declining, and it's really just stress from the wrong environmental conditions for 2 years leading up to now. Temperature extremes. So this year, I've received a lot of samples, not only ornamental samples, but wheat samples, peas that had frost damage on them. It got really hot this spring, followed by some cold snaps, and we saw a lot of frost damage. Soil structure. So if your soil is compacted, if there's construction nearby, how well drained your soil is, all have an impact on your plant's health. Soil pH is a huge one. Fertility issues, fertility nutrient deficiencies, or even excesses can burn a plant. Herbicide damage, mechanical injury can make trees more susceptible to canker diseases. Girdling, if you plant a tree, and if we saw this at the Carvel Research Station, if you plant a tree and you leave the wires on around it, it'll kill your tree. As the tree grows, it'll completely girdle it and cut off the vascular system. And animal damage, people don't think about this, but I've seen a lot of mole and vole damage with ornamental plants. I got some blueberry samples recently that had a lot of damage from moles. And here's a video about some abiotic stressors.
So it's been a really rough spring with the weather and fluctuating temperatures. We had some hot weather followed by some very cold weather, a lot of fluctuations. So this spring we saw a lot of freeze and frost damage on a lot of plants. And one of those plants that got hit pretty hard were sycamores. And it's June, and this tree is still having issues leafing out. So if I walk over here, you can see the damage that occurred, and tiny little leaves are still coming out here.
Another thing that sycamores have been battling this spring is sycamore anthracnose, which is caused by a fungus. This tree doesn't have it, but it causes leaf spots, and that's also been hard on them. So, like I said previously, diseases are often a combination of biotic and abiotic factors. So if you have a declining plant, if you take nothing else from this talk today, I want you to look at the entire environment that your plants are growing in and try to think about what other stressors they have going on besides just diseases and insect pests. You really have to look at the entire picture to try to figure out what's wrong with your plant. So an example of this was a sample from my previous job. We went to a homestead that had all of these boxwood trees or shrubs. They were of all different ages, all different cultivars, and they were just riddled with diseases, and we couldn't figure out why they were getting these diseases. So I found some weak leaf spot diseases. So you have volutella leaf spot, macrophoma leaf spot, which generally only come in if the plants are weakened by some other factor. We did find Phytophthora on the roots of some of the plants. So if you see the plant on the bottom left, how it's dying only on one side, that's often an indication of a root rot pathogen, and that plant did test positive for Phytophthora root rot. And we tested for nematodes. We didn't find any. We did find another root pathogen, Pacilomyces bucksii, which is associated with the disease boxwood decline. But none of those, oh, and we found mites as well, but none of those were the main issue here. The main issue was the soil pH was 4.7, and boxwoods like a pH of 6.5 to 7.2, and it was just so acidic in that soil that even when they planted new boxwoods, they would succumb to these diseases. So just always think in the back of your mind what else could be going on. Oftentimes it is just a disease problem, but a lot of the times it's also an environmental stressor predisposing these plants to getting a disease or an insect problem. So that's it. That's all I have for the pest walk portion of this. And I wanted to talk briefly about submitting samples to the clinic. So Townsend Hall is closed to the public, and it's closed to most faculty and staff right now. However, our lab is still open and we are receiving samples. And I just wanted to walk you guys through how to submit samples because the protocols have changed. The website can be kind of confusing, so the best way to find our clinic website is to just Google it. UD Plant Clinic, you can UD Plant Diagnostic Clinic, UDEL Plant Clinic, whatever you type in, you're going to find it okay. It's the first link here, UD Plant Diagnostic Clinic. So when you come to this page, we have our new protocols here in yellow. We have the updated protocols right here. And then we have the plant diagnostic submission form right here. If you scroll down, they're also right here, easy to see. So I'm going to show you the submission form now. So here's our form here. I made it into a fillable form. Sometimes if you open it up with the wrong program, you won't be able to open the fillable form, but it's really handy. You can just type it all into here, and then you can either print it out and submit it with your sample, or you could save it as a PDF and email it to me. Either way works fine. So that's really important to fill out the submission form with your samples so I know everything that's going on in the environment around your plant. And our new protocols for right now, since the building is closed, there are two ways to submit physical samples. The first one is by mail to this Dropbox here, and these instructions are all found on the website. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, but the extension offices are closed right now, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so the only way you can get samples to us are by either mailing them to this PO box, which we check every day during weekdays, or dropping them off physically in front of Townsend Hall. You can see a picture here of Townsend Hall. The main road is right here, and the parking lot is back here. If you can drive right in here. Parking is free right now because campus is pretty much closed, so you don't have to worry about getting parking passes or anything. And you can just run right up here. It's a blue cooler chained behind a pillar. It is not handicap accessible. It's not handicap accessible. However, if that's an issue, just contact me. My email is right here, jillp@udel.edu, and we can work something out. I can meet you outside or whatever.
Jill, in the chat, Judy had asked if we're still restricting sample submissions to commercial, and I did confirm that we are, and that we are suggesting that residential issues take advantage of our Ask an Expert, which is online. You can submit questions and also pictures that way, or you can call the garden line or connect with any of the agents, depending on which county you're in, to provide information as well.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the first thing I should have said this first. The first thing I'd like you to do is to contact your county agents with images. A lot of times we can actually figure the problem out through images. So this first paragraph here is to basically how to take good images, a couple close-ups, a couple of the entire area so we can see what's going on, submit those to your agent, and then we can go from there. And that's pretty much all I have. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jill. That was awesome.
Thank you.
So we are going to take a
Thank you.
5-minute break just to stand up, stretch our legs if you need to get a drink, but also take this time to direct any questions that you might have to Jill. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question, or if you're more comfortable, you can include your question in the chat, and Megan and I will take a look at that and recite your questions to Jill.
There was sorry, my dog heard your dog bark and now they're barking. But there was a question from Lori Graham. She said, will you accept turf samples, and how long will they last in my
So we are accepting turf samples. Depending on the issue you're worried about, what kind of issue are you having? They should last a while in your refrigerator. If you're worried about a fungal disease, up to 2 weeks, I would say, in your fridge. But the sooner the better.
The next question is, has bur oak wilt been confirmed in Delaware yet?
I do not know the answer to that question, but I am going to look into that.
Okay. And then as a follow-up to Lori's question, accepting turf samples and how long they'll last in the fridge, she's talking specifically about fungal disease.
Fungal disease. I would say up to 2 weeks, but really the sooner the better.
Do we have any additional questions?
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks, Jill.
Okay, so we're on a virtual tour somewhere. I don't even remember where I took this picture. But you can see lots of really cool plants, yay. So, I mean, Jill did an awesome job. And so now I'm just gonna bore everybody to tears, talking about insects, because I got a lot of pictures. I have a couple videos that may or may not work. We'll see how that goes. But more importantly, I wanted to make everybody aware that there is a new problematic insect in Delaware, especially for those locations where crepe myrtles are grown more commonly. Crepe myrtle bark scale is an exotic invasive arthropod that will infest crepe myrtles and lead to their decline. Here you can see the felt-like coverings. This is not in the Coccidae, which are the soft scales, or the Diaspidids, which are the armored scales. This belongs to the group known as the felt scales. They are on the branches and trunks of crepe myrtles, and they have a white felt-like covering. Again, entomologists are really creative in how we come up with our names. So felt scale. If you happen to see this white growth on your crepe myrtles, you would need to contact Cooperative Extension as soon as possible, and then we would most likely be contacting the Department of Agriculture thereafter. There has been a case of this found in Sussex County, and another potential case we're waiting confirmation. Be a little bit closer up view, the rounder. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. I'm hoping so. But on the picture on the right, the very elongated ones that are like rice grains, those are the males. The ones that are more spherical are the females. On the picture on the left, you'll see this pinkish coloration. The scales themselves are pinkish in their color, or salmon colored potentially. And then this is a picture of eggs with the old female skin covering having removed. Females lay eggs and then they die. So crepe myrtle is definite host. I mean, no surprise since we call it the crepe myrtle bark scale. Twigs, branches in the trunk. We're not sure how many generations we're going to have in Delaware, partly because we're not sure how many there are in the Southeast where it was first introduced. But anywhere between 2 and 4 generations per growing season. Here we have, again, eggs coming out from an ovisac that has been punctured. So you will have at any given time various stages. You'll have eggs, immatures or crawlers, and then settled nymphs, and then potential reproductive males that are looking for females at any given time. So you'll have an overlap, which makes treatment and management quite difficult. One of the things you can do for management is the use of neonicotinoids, such as imidacloprid or dinotefuran. However, there is current concerns about potential impacts on pollinators, both native and honeybees. And so, unfortunately, those neonicotinoids are efficacious at helping us manage this pest. It's just then we have to be careful on how much we use them so that we minimize impact on the arthropods we want. Speaking of wanting arthropods, this is one that is quite commonly found here in Newcastle County now, and it is one we do not want. It is another exotic invasive insect that was introduced not into the Southeast like crepe myrtle bark scale, but into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania won the lottery and has been the state to first encounter these. They are the spotted lantern flies. If you see these, hashtag hitchhiker bug. Delaware is where we need to report the findings of these. Carrie can verify that they are jumping and running and crawling about landscapes in Newcastle County. I saw some here. This was at Nemours on a magnolia, quite a few. Any given time on any different part of vegetation right now. This is the first and second instar. What the first instar looks like, second instar looks like this as well, just bigger. This is what the adult looks like. We had a early hatch of eggs compared to previous years. And then we cooled off a little bit, so it's delayed their development some to where they're now back into their normal time frame. But The egg masses are pictured here on the right, and they're hard to see. They're kind of a grayish brown, almost like a silly putty or gray masses of mud on the side of the bark of a tree, of the trunk of a tree. There are 4 stages. The first, second, and third are black and white. The fourth one has red, and I have a picture of those here in a moment. The adults start showing up in July, and then they dominate August through November. Their most prefer to plant is tree of heaven. Then they prefer grapes. They'll also get on hops, but they do a lot of late season feeding as adults on red maples and a lot of egg laying on red maples. Here are just 3 states where they've been found with breeding populations. They've been found in other states as well, and they're looking to confirm whether or not they have an established population there or not. So again, these are on the left, the first and second instars. As you get into July or the end of June, you'll start seeing this red and white and black insects show up. That is the last instar, the 4th instar nymph. So you'll have mixed populations of these black and white polka dotted ones along with the red, black, and white insects. Usually by late July, you're starting to see the adults show up. There's a close-up of the 4th instar. Isn't it cute? The little sucker, literally. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they belong in the hemipteran group, or a true bug. So this sucker eventually develops into what we see here on the left, which is the adult stage. And you don't see the bright red until they open their wings up. Sometimes they're confused as moths, but they're not. They are a type of hopper, type of plant hopper. And so when they open up their wings, you can see the red color and coloration on their hind wings. They are able to jump quite far, and both nymphs and adults are incredibly fast. Part of the problem is you don't want to have them at all, because on the picture on the left, you can see a tree that looks like it's got scales or something all over it. That's hundreds, if not 1,000 or so, of those spotted lantern flies. And they gather around the trunk, especially close to the base of the trunk, and will feed from September through November. When they're in September feeding stage, they'll often crawl up towards upper branches, and they will start to lay egg masses from the base of the trunk up into some upper canopy branches and up high up on the trunk itself. This white arrow in the picture on the white points to an egg mass. It's kind of whitish in coloration. Those egg masses that have been recently oviposited, which is the egg laying procedure that they undergo or that they perform. After the eggs have been oviposited, she covers them with a substance that appears white. As that hardens, it becomes that grayish, muddish looking color and helps it blend in so that it's harder to remove them. Speaking of hard to see, they'll like to lay them down in nooks and crannies and gaps or holes in the bark. So here on the picture on the left in the yellow circle, we have 4 different egg masses. We got 1 here, 2, 3, and 4, just in a tiny space. And each egg mass can have anywhere between 30 and 50 eggs. Over here on the right, you can see that there's an egg mass here, just on the rough bark. They also will lay them virtually anywhere, much like gypsy moths would. So on the underneath surfaces of picnic tables, on nearby rocks, onto decks, onto field posts, garden equipment, sheds. As long as it's got a hard, smooth surface, in some form or fashion, they're going to try to lay eggs on them. You'll notice the picture here on the right on the rock, the egg mass, it looks like it's kind of cracking. That assists with the eggs being able to hatch at some point. So it dries from being white to being this gray coloration, and then it'll get little fine cracks in it, which helps when the eggs hatch, the nymphs come crawling out. The nymphs can move quite far, even as a first instar. All right, so those are the two new exotic invasive insects that I needed to have your attention for. I'd appreciate your attention to the rest of what I'm going to say. However, at some point you may feel like I'm actually talking about the science of napping. And that's not intentional, but with everybody in their cozy chair with possible blanket because the air conditioning is cold, it could happen. I understand. Insects, I think, are absolutely exciting, and you can find them everywhere. In fact, insects outnumber all other species on the planet. There's only 350,000 plant species known and found on good planet Earth. There's only been 1.4 million animal species. And of those 1.4 million animal species, 81% of them are arthropods. 88% of that 81% are insects. So basically 71% of all animals found on planet Earth that have been identified are insects. And the fun thing is we haven't even identified half of the insects. So as we are talking around the home or in the landscape, one thing to recognize is that arthropods include both arachnida and insecta or hexapoda. And so there are differences that we need to be aware of. So insects have 3 body regions. Arachnids have 1 or 2. The arachnids are mites or spiders. And then you have a variety of different, both beneficial, incidental, and pest insect species that you come across. And they all play a role in integrated pest management in some form or fashion. The important thing for IPM, especially in landscapes, is scouting and paying attention to your plants. Insect identification is also incredibly important so that we know what to apply and when. Scouting, once you found something, keeping track of it so you know if it's going to potentially be a problem is important, especially if you're in a landscape. Cultural practices can help minimize impacts of pests. Biological control or utilizing those arthropods that will help us manage pests. And then chemical control, when necessary, we have to go to the shed and pull out something to suppress those insects or arthropods causing problems. One of the things that's nice is to document what you see so that you don't repeat errors from previous years in dealing with problems, that you're able to address things right away in the most efficient manner possible, saving both time and money. All right, so with insect identification, this picture here, I know there's probably some of you that have sat in and listened to my presentations in the past and already know what this insect is. It's on this picture, but I'll give you a couple seconds to think of what you believe this is. So if anybody can identify that, or if you've got an idea what it is, just hold on to that. Most people, when they see this picture, feel like I am showing them a picture of a yellow jacket. In fact, it is actually a pest of ash trees. It is a lilac ash tree borer, which, due to our research efforts in our demonstration gardens in Newcastle County and Sussex, we have had some of them attack our ash trees. So in the fall, circumstances providing, we may have educational opportunities on how to best manage this particular pest. This particular insect on this slide is not a wasp. It is a moth, a day-flying moth known as a cicid. With IPM or managing our pests in landscapes, the important thing is to remember that you're going to have some key plants or plants that hold down or are dominant in your landscape. And those plants are going to have particular pests that they have to worry about, or you have to worry about with them. So if you're talking about a dogwood, as Jill mentioned earlier, you may be having to watch out for leaf spots. The powdery mildew may or may not be a concern for you depending on your view or your client's view. Same way with some of the leaf spots, may or may not be an issue depending on how much actual pest management needs to be done. So knowing what your host plant is can help inform you as to what your possible problems could be for the upcoming year. Arthropod wise, usually you're going to have about 10 species of arthropods in a landscape that's going to account for 97% of those pests that you encounter. Of the insect species that are out there, only 3 to 5%, maybe 7% of the insect species that have been identified are actually insects that cause problems. The rest of them are either beneficial or are just animals out and about doing their own thing, eating what they eat, and not really causing any harm to structures or long-term health considerations for the plants that we have in the landscape. Identification can be challenging. There's a lot of different arthropods that are out there. I'm going to quickly go through this slide with identification. So here we have a bagworm that is into free fall mode, dangling from some silk thread as he's looking for new food to eat. In the lower left here, we have what looks like things sticking up off a leaf. Those are galls caused by aphids. We have a lady beetle, a jumping spider, an azalea lace bug, not a bee. Below that in the center, that is actually a fly. It's called a syrphid fly or a hover fly, a beneficial arthropod, beneficial insect. Down below, we have stippling damage from oak lace bug. On the right, we have columbine that has been infected with leaf miner. And in the top right, we have orange striped oak caterpillars. Things that you may see in your garden or in your landscape throughout the year could include things like these white things at the base of this plant. You can find those on leaves, stems, branches at times. Those are basically the shed skins of insects. So as an insect feeds and grows, it will crawl out the back of its skin as it goes from one life stage to the next. If it's an insect that produces honeydew, like an aphid, those skins will get stuck in that sticky liquid or that sticky fecal material and remain on the plant. On the right, we have mites. This is southern red mite. When they go from being a larva to a deutonymph to a tridonymph to an adult, they shed skins. Those skins can get caught in the webbing that they form on the undersides of those leaves. And so that gives you if you see these white little things, there's a possibility that you have had either an aphid or a mite on your plant, and you may be able to find the actual feeding life stage elsewhere on the plant or nearby. Some insects leave conspicuous egg masses. These are brown marmorated stink bug eggs on an apple, crab apple. Sometimes they don't disperse away quite quickly enough, and you'll see them sitting there right next to where they emerged out of these eggs. You can have cupping of the leaves. This is on a boxwood. See the little white fluffs in there? That is fecal material caused, and the cupping is also caused by the psyllid that is inside there. You have leaf curling that can be caused by a number of insects. Thrips are one. The ones you're seeing in these pictures are caused by aphids. One of the important things to recognize when you're looking at insect identification is knowing what your host plant is supposed to look like when there aren't any problems present. So this is an oak tree, and obviously oak trees are not supposed to have this blanching sort of effect in there. That is called stippling. So that's not normal, so something is probably causing it. Up here we have window painting, also not normal. So when you look closer, you can flip it over, I'm trying to get this to move. You'll see some insects on the undersides of the leaves. Insects are frequently on the underside. And you can see them, whether they're the oak lace bugs like we see here, or if they're young instar caterpillars feeding gregariously, causing the window painting. If you look on the underside, you can potentially find them. Caterpillars eventually grow up to where they're bigger and will consume large portions of the leaf. Chewing damage, different types. You have skeletonization, often caused by Japanese beetles, like we see here on the top left. Down below, on the bottom left, we have blotch leaf miners. Top right, we have stippling that can be caused by lace bugs, can be caused by spider mites of different species. But they have those piercing, sucking mouth parts where they're removing small sections of chlorophyll, and that's how that lighter coloration comes into being. You can have divoting, which we see in the lower right, where the insect feeds to the top portion of the leaf and then leaves, and then the area where it fed kind of browns out as that tissue dries out and leaves what looks like divots in the leaf. Also recognizing what is not insect. Here we have an example of yellow-bellied sapsucker damage to bird. All the holes here, a lot of times this is confused as being borers. It is in fact where a bird comes in and removes the bark so that the tree weeps and it gets the sap. You can tell it's sapsucker because everything is in a nice straight line or a uniform pattern. Insects are much more random when they're coming out most of the time. Now that we're not sure where I'm going to be going or what I'm talking about, we're going to proceed forward. Again, I got examples of, keeping track of what an insect actually is. Most of the time, people would consider these to be caterpillars. On the left, you would be correct. On the right, you would be wrong. On the left is the yellow-necked caterpillar. On the right is the dusky birch sawfly. The sawflies are a wasp. Caterpillar, of course, is a lepidopteran or a butterfly or a moth. Some sawflies will be on coniferous plants as well as deciduous, and they can also be found on deciduous plants. Caterpillars of the same species can have different color morphs. So here we have yellow-necked caterpillar that is in a black color morph, and then one here that is in a red color morph. So here we have a picture of a plant that is planted. It's planted fine, but it is improperly mulched. This is what we call a mulch mountain, and you should never see a tree that's mulched like that. Stresses the plant and can eventually lead to the death of the plant. Putting plants in the proper place, giving them the proper moisture, sunlight, in the right areas of pH, as Jill had mentioned with her boxwoods, and giving them the fertility that they need, all help reduce stresses and susceptibility to diseases and insects. So following proper planting techniques can often be half the battle in keeping your plants pest-free. Pruning out areas or removing plants that are infested with disease or insect when you have them close like this can help prevent the spread. So these are 3 shrubs. The middle one died or was in great decline. Instead of removing it, they let it be. It has spread to the shrub on the right. They'd cut it out, you'd had less of a problem. On the picture on the right, you have these dead branches on a red maple. Cut them out. Try to maintain the aesthetic appearance of the plant whenever possible, but why leave a problem in close proximity to where it could potentially do more harm? Move that dead stuff out if you can so that it does, the insects that are resting there can't move to the nearby healthy tissues. Some plants, as Jill had mentioned, with disease resistance in dogwoods, exists as well for insects. So in this picture, this whitish colored azalea is highly susceptible to azalea lacebug, whereas the others in this picture have varying, easy for me to say, varying degrees of susceptibility. Some are more resistant to lacebugs than others. Here's my first attempt at a video. We'll see how it goes. Here we can see that there are a variety of different plants that are here. Anytime you can have different trees and shrubs, let's see if I can move on. Aha, I was. Anytime you can have different plants in a landscape, you're providing opportunities for insects to do well. You'll increase the number of insects you have. That initially sounds like a potentially bad thing, but it is not. Increasing your diversity increases your insect species count, or the number of different insects you have. That all reduces your pest pressure. Having more insects present reduces the pest pressure on your plants. Well, why is that? If you make sure that you're having flowering plants or plants that produce pollen in your flower beds, in your landscape, you're giving greater opportunities for natural enemies and parasitoids to come in and remain in the area. They will stick around and sometimes feed on pollen when they would prefer to feed on insects, but they'll stay there because there's food available. And so having a diversity of plants leads to a diversity of insects, which keeps your arthropods you want to have around in your landscape, because then they will feed on the pests if they show up, and they'll help keep your pest problems or your pest insects that are present, will keep them suppressed to where they don't cause noticeable injury or health concerns for your other plants. Here you can see an example of some flowering plants, or plants like this purple flash ornamental pepper that provides lots of pollen for minute pirate bugs or lady beetles, so that they stay around where you have plants you want to have, so that they'll feed on the pests that will get on those later. So generalist predators will come into areas that have a diversity of plants, like we see here. We have an assassin bug on the left feeding on lacebug. We have a green lacewing feeding on scale insects and whiteflies on the right, all because they have a diverse habitat in which to thrive. Green lacewings are skittish and generally don't want to be seen, but they do a great job at removing soft-bodied insects in the landscape. On the left, we have an adult. In the middle, she lays her eggs. These are lacewing eggs. They're laid at these ends of these stalks, close to what we have on the bottom is an aphid. So when they hatch, they're going to encounter aphids. And as we can see on the right, an immature lacewing They feed on hundreds of aphids a day per individual lacewing nymph. An individual lacewing nymph can consume over 300 aphids in a single day if the population is there. Here we have an assassin bug. I know most people don't like Japanese beetles or brown marmorated stink bugs. Assassin bugs will eat those. Spiders. Lots of people don't like to have spiders in the garden. However, they help with a variety of soft-bodied insects and those that have hard exoskeletons as well. Here we see a jumping spider eating a caterpillar. Here we have an arboreal spider feeding on stink bugs. So they feed on a variety of pest insects. Here we have an example of a jumping spider that was feeding on dogwood sawfly. This, some people may not recognize, but this is actually a lady beetle. It's an immature form. And so this will feed on many, many, many different types of soft-bodied insects. Small caterpillars, scale crawlers, aphids, just to name a few. This is what the lady beetle pupa looks like. And everybody already knows what the lady beetle adult looks like. Here's an example of one. This is a native species. It's Columella maculata. Fantastic predator of aphids in the landscape. So that was beneficials in 6.3 seconds. Now that we're really having fun, we're going to proceed on to some pests that we're going to find. In the spring, we're kind of reaching the end of when we're going to see a lot of this, but it's commonly found. Here we have a cherry tree that was stressed and had bark split. Bark beetles came in, females tunneled in and have laid eggs into this tree. A telltale sign are the frass toothpicks that you see on the side here. You may see them sticking out the side of trunks or branches. What happens is when they crow in or dig in, they make a gallery and bring in a fungus. The fungus jams up or clogs up the conductive tissues, the xylem tissues, and the eggs hatch and the insect feeds on the fungus, which happens to be breaking down some of the wood and clogging it up. The frass can get so bad, or infestations can get so bad, you may see frass pile up the base of the trees. Here's an example of a gallery with the immatures inside and that fungal staining that you can see. The beetles look quite large here. This is just so that you can get a close-up of what they look like. Some people think they look cute, I guess. But they are basically the size of a grain of rice. So they feed on a number of different plants. The one on the left generally will attack most that are apparently healthy and those that are stressed. The one on the right generally will attack those that are more stressed and occasionally can attack those that will look to be healthy. Emerald ash borer right now has been found in our state. One of the telltale signs that you can notice in June and July of their activity is the thinning of the canopy. And here you see how an ash tree with thinning canopy may look. That could be caused by ash rust as well. So you need to get in close and look at the tree and see if you can see any emergence holes or sucker growth or bark splitting. In Delaware, we set up demonstrations on the farm here in Newcastle County next to campus, and then also at the Carville Research Station. Here you can see some of the conditions we planted our plants. Really wet clay soils, planted too deep, or they were planted properly and overly mulched, all to stress the plants so that we could have borers show up. Now, I found an emergence hole. Emerald ash borer has a D-shaped emergence hole. Saw this little critter in there, was wondering what it was, and sure enough, eventually started coming out. And this was just last week in Sussex County at the Cargill Research Center. Emerald ash borers are coming out. What they will do is they'll come out, fly to foliage, feed on it for a few days, mate, and the females will start laying eggs on the trunk of the tree. Bark spray, soil injections, or trunk injections with various insecticides can be used to get this pest under control. One that is starting to hatch now are bagworms. Here we have an example of blue spruce, perfectly fine, or so the owner thought. He didn't notice that there were bagworms hanging on it, and he went away for 2 weeks, and this is what he came home to. So they can be quite devastating if you do not watch your things like spruce, arborvitae, junipers, lelands. They are all susceptible, as well as some of our deciduous trees can get bagworms. So what are they up close? Here you can see a bag from last year. It's brown. The older they are, the more gray they will become. They do not fall off the plant. The caterpillar, when it pupates, ties it to the branch with silken threads so that it does not fall off. They can persist on a tree for a number of years afterwards. On the picture on the right, we can see an example of a bag found in July. You'll notice that it is mostly green, and you can kind of see, I'm trying to get my cursor to show up. Up here at the top is the caterpillar. He carries this bag around with him. Basic window for management of bagworms: September through mid-May. Just pick bags off and then destroy those bags. You can cut them up with scissors, step on them, throw them in the trash. Careful burning in time frames in which it is permissible is another option. That's what the bags will kind of look like as you're doing that between September and May. The brown ones and the gray ones you're going to be pulling off because that's all that there's going to be September through May. Every other bag will have eggs in it, generally speaking. Their sex ratio is usually about 1 to 1. So the female, she calls out or throws perfume into the air. Males follow it back to her. They mate, she lays eggs and dies. So the eggs overwinter in bags. So between September and mid-May, any bag you're removing, almost every other one is going to have eggs in it. So any you remove greatly reduces the population for the upcoming year. In June, I don't know if you can see this, I can barely see it. In June or July, you can use things like BT Kerstaki, commonly found in a number of garden centers or box stores. Spinosad, often called Captain Jack's dead bug. There's other spinosad products out there. We'll all manage them at this stage, and you can see that the bags are up. They're called dunce caps at this stage because they look like what you typically would have referred to as dunce caps long ago. They're up. The bags that are light and small, and the caterpillar can carry them up. As they continue to feed, they eventually become so heavy and large that they drop. I'm trying to be able to see. Well, I'm having problems with my computer. Okay. So they eventually become so heavy that they hang down, and then they stay that way. July, you could still try BT depending on the size of your bag. There are a couple professional products out there that are listed like we see here. The chlorantraniliprole you might be able to find as a homeowner. It's hard to say. Some places will have it, others won't. Tebufenazide is an insect growth regulator for caterpillars and is usually a professional-oriented product. Acephate, you can find that for homeowner or professional, same way with 7 or any of the pyrethroids that are out there. Pyrethroids are products that end Their active ingredient ends in THRIN, and they're broad spectrum, meaning that they will have impacts on the good insects and the one that you're actually targeting. Once you get into August, if you haven't noticed the bagworms by now, which sometimes happens, if you get into August, you need to pick the bag off and look and see if you have caterpillar in there or not. Because sometime in August, before you get to the 20th, usually, they are in the process of making cocoons so that they can come out. The males anyway will come out as a moth. And so if they are in the process of making cocoons, they'll no longer feed and your treatments would do nothing. So here's another video that I have. Hopefully this is illuminating. Here we see window painting caused by row slug sawfly. Turn it over and there you have the critters. They look like caterpillars, but again, they're not. They are plant feeding wasps. This is the window painting. They've crawled over here. Eventually the window pane dries out and falls off, so it looks like a hole. But you can find those caterpillar-like insects on the underside. A spinosad product will manage those fine. Port oil or insecticidal soap, neem oil will also work, but you have to get the underside of the foliage to make sure that you have efficacy because they're feeding on the underside. There are 3 different species here. Some of them consume the entire leaf. Let's see. There we go. So anywhere from mid-May to mid-June, you may have them feeding. They often will start out with window painting, but eventually that window pane, that tissue will dry out and fall out, and you'll get these nice, smooth, even holes. This is a close-up of what the sawfly immature looks like in the top right. I have listed here a variety of control products that would be available. The fun thing with roses is they have so many potential problems. They're just nice to have in the landscape so that you can see all the insects and watch what they do. Here's another example of row slug sawfly. We had mentioned when Jill was talking about the disease, the funky growth on azaleas, and she said you could put them out in the lands, more out of the shade and into the sun. Azaleas in the shade can get lace bugs as well, but generally speaking, the azaleas are happier there, and so they have fewer pest issues. One exception to that could be is if the soil's not right. Azaleas like acidic soils, and if you've got them in more neutral soils or basic soils, the plant's not going to be happy, and you could have high lace bug populations on an azalea in shade if the soil pH is inappropriate. So having azaleas and rhododendrons where they want to be or as close as possible to conditions that they like help reduce lace bug populations. On the right-hand side, we have on the upper right the immature lace bug. It's got the spines coming off the back. And on the bottom right, we have the adult lace bug. Lace bugs will get on a variety of plants. They get on oaks, sycamores, cotoneasters, hawthorns, for different species for some of those. For example, hawthorn lace bug will get on hawthorns and cotoneasters. So just knowing what your host plant is can help you narrow down the number of generations you're going to have in a year and what the pest actually is. The picture underneath the text, if you'll see all those brownish, blackish spots, those are called tar spots. You may or may not see lace bug on your plant, but if you have tar spots, those gray spots or blackish spots, those are the fecal material of lace bugs. So if you don't see the lace bug, it's probably on a different leaf feeding elsewhere on the plant, but you probably have it. or you've had them and the natural enemies have come in and cleaned them up. Lady beetles, lace wings, the generalist predator I talked about earlier, will feed on these. It just sometimes takes them a little bit to show up to get the population suppressed or under control as needed. There's also some parasitic wasps or parasitoids that'll attack this insect as well. Scales. I got 15 minutes to talk about scales. Awesome. So these are the soft scales, the coccids, or the armored scales, the diaspidids. And here I have listed the differences between the two. Test, that's a technical term that we use, but basically the soft scales, their outer covering is attached to them, and the armored scales, their outer covering is separate. It is not attached. You can pick it off and the insect will remain attached to the plant. Soft scales, you pick it off, you're removing everything. Armored scales, you could get that covering off and the insect would still be there. Soft scales are usually larger and produce honeydew. Honeydew is that sugary fecal material that's really sticky and shiny that'll get on the foliage. And eventually we'll have sooty mold, a black fungus that'll grow on it. They produce hundreds to thousands of eggs, the soft scale do. And the nymphs will, and early stage females can remain mobile. Armored scales are generally pretty small. They feed on woodier tissues, so there's no honeydew. They also produce many, many fewer eggs, usually less than 100 per female. And once that crawler settles, they're not moving anymore. So here's an example of an insect on the left. This is tulip tree magnolia or magnolia scale. They produce lots of honeydew. And you can see examples of this black splotching, that's sooty mold growing on honeydew that's fallen from branches above this one. The picture in the middle of the tannish looking trunk, that's what the magnolia should look like. When you look to the right of that, that grayish appearance, that's all due to sooty mold growing on honeydew that's ran down the trunk. One of our most common soft scales seen in the area are cottony camellia, cottony taxus scales. They're frequently found on a variety of hollies on the undersides of their leaves. They feed April and May, producing fair bits of honeydew. And then sometime in May, depending on how warm or cool we are, they will start to produce what we call ovisacs. Well, the ovisacs are illustrated here in the picture on the right. Those ovisacs will look long and white with little white or brownish tops or sections. Here we see that the top end or end is brown, and then you got this long white strip that comes off. It's very soft and felt-like, or almost like powdery. The brown portion is where the female was. The reason why I say was is because the female lays eggs and dies. This white is the ovisac, hundreds of eggs within. So this leaf has easily 1,000 eggs on it. The reason why a plant doesn't quickly become overcome and die is because the natural enemies feed on a vast majority of those. They're small and have small opportunity to settle and make it to a place to feed, or they get blown off by the wind. Being blown off by the wind is one way they will move through a landscape planting. So having plants close together gives opportunity for spread of this insect from plant to plant. The picture on the lower left underneath the text is an example of how intense the honeydew sooty mold can be on a holly that is heavily infested with cottony camellia taxus scale. There are a number of pulvinaria species. I can't always spell pulvinaria correct. I think we'll see that in another slide. But this is the correct spelling for pulvinaria. There are a number of species of pulvinaria we have in our area. One is the cottony maple scale. that gets on a number of host plants and will be found on stems and branches and produces large waxy ovisacs as well. And then there is a cottony maple leaf pulvinaria scale in which it is found on the leaves of the plants, much like you see here with the cottony taxus camellia scale. This is a picture of the cottony maple scale. And here you can see that this infestation was really heavy. You can see the female here, the brown, and then the big long white ovisac. She's dead, and the ovisac has eggs in it. The one thing with scales is they will persist on the plant. So if you're seeing this in July, those eggs have already hatched and moved to the foliage and are feeding. The female and the ovisac will remain until they weather off or somebody removes them. That may take a few months for that to occur. Same way with the cottony camellia taxus scale. You see that in November, that insect is elsewhere on that plant, could be on the leaf, but that structure that you're seeing is not a live insect any longer. It can take months for that to weather away.
Hey, Brian.
Yes.
Great, quick, we have a question from Suzanne. Can scale grow on stucco?
Not that I'm aware. If you're having something on stucco, I'd need to see a picture. Could be artillery fungus spores. I've seen that before, and it looks, I mean, there's small black specks that you can see on stucco or on siding. I've seen that before. But scale are plant feeders. Here's another attempt at the video. Are we done? I guess. Okay. Another attempt at video. Let's see how this goes. So here you can see that this trunk looks a little black. This is honey locust. There's the cottony maple scale. Here we have some bug eggs up on one of the leaflets. There's a number of insects that will go after them. Here we have, it's kind of hard to see, little brown nodules that are on here. This is calico scale on honey locust. You can, if you see honey locust in a parking lot, go look at the plant, and more than likely you're going to see calico scale. Those crawlers on calico scale are emerging and crawling now. The calico scale adult will often have these white spots on it. She can be brown to black with these white spots. The eggs hatch, the crawlers move to foliage and feed. In the fall, just before the plant senesces, they move back to the stems and settle to overwinter. They feed in the spring when temperatures warm up and swell, produce their eggs. And so these swollen females have had eggs in them, and they are in the process of hatching. Here we see an example of what color the eggs are, and a black and white color morph of the calico scales. These are females that have swollen. You puncture that exoskeleton and you see the eggs underneath her. These too will persist throughout the year. Females lay the eggs and die, but the covering remains. They have to weather off, or somebody has to pull them off for them to disappear. Crawler activity is May and into the middle of June, but then they will continue to feed all the way until the fall. Tulip tree scale is our largest scale species. So is magnolia scale. They're about the same and indistinguishable unless you do microscopic examination. Their crawlers are active in August, produce copious amounts of honeydew in July and August, enough to where the honeydew can cover branches enough so that the sooting mold will reduce photosynthesis enough to reduce the branch life, and you'll have branch dieback. A scale that has crawler activity going on right now are Fletcher scale or Lacanium scales. Fletcher scales are on the coniferous plants, the more evergreen plants. Deciduous plants that have these little brown nodules on them are the licanium scales. So here's a picture of oak licanium. European fruit licanium you'll get on something on like on dogwood or on red buds. And they're gonna look, the plant should not have these little brown nodules on them. The nodules you can pick off and there'd be eggs underneath. And then some of those eggs are currently hatching. The crawlers move to foliage, feed there until the plant senesces. Just before senescence, they crawl back to stems. Hopefully, we encounter plant problems before it reaches this stage. Here we have a maple with serious branch dieback, partially suffering from over mulching. You got a mulch mountain there. I'm going to attempt to move in closer, so sorry for motion sickness. There's white fleckings and that black flecking there that's on there. Here we see gloomy scale. It's found on red maples, obscure scale if it is on an oak. Here's another example where you can see that there's a bunch of black little spots. Those are all scale insects. They don't belong. It's not the way the maple should look. And as you look out, you can see that these branches are dead or are in the process of dying. The white is from where the scale has weathered off. It still leaves a mark. Here's a close-up of the obscure or gloomy scale on maple. These white little elongated and brown elongated are Japanese maple scale. Brief overview of obscure scale and gloomy scale. Obscure scale is going to be on oak predominantly, gloomy scale on maple. All that black dots, each one of those is an individual scale. Now with armored scale, just like the soft scale, they don't come off the plant unless they weather off. And in this picture, where the white dots are, that's where they've weathered off. So to know what your population of scale is on a plant, you need to take a sample and look under a microscope, because the scale coverings can persist from year to year up to a number of years on a plant. So it may look like it's heavily infested, and in fact it may be less than what you think, because natural enemies and predators and parasitoids have gotten in and helped kept it suppressed. You're just seeing the remains or the carcasses of those bodies on the plant still. So you have to flip the cover off and look and see what's underneath. If it's empty underneath, they're dead and gone and no longer there. If it's squishy or squishers, like Tracy likes to say, then you've got an active scale infestation. I'm trying to hurry up because I have exactly 43 seconds before I get the old hook from Carrie. Here, I'm almost finished though. We have Japanese maple scale, probably our most dominantly found armored scale in the landscape in the mid-Atlantic. Variety of hosts, a large number of hosts. Yep, there's Carrie. She's gonna come get me. There are 2 generations a year. One of the reasons why it's difficult for management for this is that their generations overlap. At any given time, you're going to have adults and you're going to have immatures or eggs. And so getting a product out that will give you sustained control is difficult. The first generation is about to start hatching. Some may already have, depending on the microclimate. And then the second generation is usually around the end of July through the beginning of August. And with that, I'll go ahead and take questions. One that most people, I assume, would have is, why can't mosquitoes suck fat instead of blood? Thought that's pretty awesome. But now that I have finished and there's still daylight left, after handling questions, if you want to go run through your own garden and look for insects, feel free and enjoy.